Okay, now we can start our next panel. I'm very glad that you are part of this conference and to greet you from Belgrade. This was for a long time conceived program, and I think it should bring some change in our understanding of contemporary art and activism. My name is Milica Lapčević. I'm a part of ArtTerror independent video and film production that was founded in 1989. And besides being artist with a number of festivals and exhibitions, I'm also a journalist in culture, working with critical essays, articles, interviews, and other material about art and culture. I would like to give a very short introduction. Very briefly, our session now is dedicated to museums. Ever since 17th century, museums have been cardinal points of communication between generation of artists and wider audience, which grew in its number and habits. Futurism at the beginning of 20th century wished to make a turnover, rejecting the heritage of the past. So did many others, taking innovative and often radical attitudes towards this kind of institution and everything that it represents. Art historian and critic Lucy Lippard retold the story about art workers' coalition and series of actions, questioning establishment of MoMA and New York art scene in 1969. Artists' requests in the major part were not fulfilled then. Do we have space today to evaluate, plan, and act in order to re-examine purpose, strategy, practices, and institutional format such as museum, or maybe a biennale? We are aware of the growth of the number of biennale in the world. All these sorts of clustered taste, finance, and politics-based shows that foster positive but also many problematic projections and visions about strategy of handling, destiny, and context of every in each artwork. So this was just widest introduction, and I would like to invite our panelists to take part. I'm glad to present Mateusz Sapija from Poland, who is at the moment independent curator and researcher, associate curator of Asukasa Tokyo, and he works on PhD in history of art at the University of Edinburgh, with a number of collaborations with public and private galleries, perennial exhibitions to independent art spaces. Mateusz Sapija dedicated most of his career to exploration of curatorial concepts. Are you there, Mateusz?
I'm here, yes.
Let us hear your presentation, an exhibition as a site for radical democracy, Selection.pl.
Thank you very much. I will share my screen with you. Can you see it?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, great. So, Selection.pl was organized as part of At the Very Center of Attention, lasting a whole year series of solo exhibitions by selected major artists, aiming to reveal the potential of Polish art scene. This Polish year in Poland was disassembled right at the start by Paweł Athamer and Artur Żmijewski, who decided to hijack the concept and return to their own university experience. The project evolved through multiplication. Two artists invited by the Center of Contemporary Art in Warsaw joined forces and expanded their endeavor to other participants. Initially, their former classmates, but in due course also to other parties. Mentally handicapped, school children, prostitutes, and finally anyone else scouted to the project for a classified ad in daily newspaper. Instead of a blockbuster exhibition, however, an unforeseeable process has materialized. As a starting point, the project took the common space private space, a canonic exercise laying fundamentals for the participatory character of Grzegorz Kowalski's pedagogic method. The exercise is based on nonverbal processes of communication through signs, signals, and gestures, depending on the situation and actions of other participants. At the beginning, every participant has their own private space located in the common space. Gradually, both spaces are integrating, overlapping itself, and ultimately merging. Selection.pl was a fundamental modification of this pedagogic exercise, something which could be seen as violation of the rules, but also as a creative elaboration. It meant to correct its weaknesses, seen by Żmijewski as eliminating forces of reality and limiting the wider perspective. The actions of participants or the reactions of the public were not planned in any way. The project enforced only one rule of participation. Any group member could amend, adapt, improve, or destroy anyone else's contribution. The participants pushed destruction so far that in fact it tested the limits of CCA as a cultural institution. As commented by Kowalski, introducing destruction was unacceptable by some, including himself, who decided to withdraw at this stage, although cognitively highly beneficial. It is impossible to analyze Selection.pl without addressing the mainstream turn taken by Polish art world in the early 2000s. While throughout the 1990s, Polish artists were primarily exploring the relationship between art and social politics, the consequent years exposed the social turn as impactless. An ongoing series of scandals, acts of censorship, and dismissals, finally physical attacks on art, resulted in the gradual slide towards creating ARTWORLD's image as professionalized and economically prospectful. Consequently, local institutions introduced to its rhetoric the notion of success, applied similarly to gradually neoliberal reality of now sociopolitically transformed Poland. Thus, a range of exhibitions were expected to contribute to a young art boom, which indeed has materialized. However, every paradigm shift of that kind requires reference points in the form of art historical myths. Kowalski's studio suited this role perfectly as a time space in which several personalities and ideas came together and emerged as internationally recognized and impactful phenomena. The common space private space exercise was a myth within this myth, and thus a suitable subject for at the center of attention's framework. The project came to life as a resultant of several ambitions and aims. To create a utopian space, but also to destabilize the existing norm, which resulted in the tension between Alzheimer's boys' invitation to become artists and Żmijewski's destructive tendencies, resulting in burning other artists' work. The resulting effect was also a statement towards the unfairness of the art world, with its low-quality debates, corrupted choices, and drive towards productivity and profitability. This last set of aspects was particularly visible due to the presence of former artists, wannabe artists, unrecognized artists, potential artists, and never gonna be artists. This game with institutional consecration allowed Selection.pl to create particular type of collaboration and rebellion, acutely inspiring and putting the aspect of institutional critique to the front. Żmijewski and Alzheimer refused to produce solo exhibitions within the framework as they did not agree to a division into the better, in example, those who managed as artists, and those who dropped out, the worse. They decided to travel back in time to the state before the institutional filtration and before the negotiation of the worth of artists and their work. The project treated the exhibition as a process in which the authorship is blurred and broke away from both exhibition requirements and institutional conventions. At the same time, it became a challenge to the very principle of institutions' operations, an endeavor which almost dismantled it from inside, forming an institutional critique assignment which occupied the space just between the pressures of the market and the state. At large, the project emerged in a response to a set of challenges. The CCA's will to contribute to mainstream turn within the scene and position itself within it, as well as the pivotal parliamentary election revealing a deep societal division and a slow rise of populist politics. Indeed, a heated public discussion muddied with populism influenced Selection.pl. The project's preparations coincided with the elections, ending up with the right-wing Law and Justice Party forming a coalition with the agrarian populist Self-Defense and a radical right-wing League of Polish Families. In this way, the political forces, always treated as alien to the art world, took a central spot in the power and public realm. During the campaign, Law and Justice rebranded economic and political issues for a discourse mimicking earlier conspirational visions of Polish post-socialist transformation, being taken over by the immoral pact of the elites. As an outcome, Law and Justice united the rhetoric of its junior coalition partners, the anti-liberal economic narrative with the framework of social-cultural Christianity fortress, ultimately merging several conflicts into one meta-narrative and reconfiguring the societal and political divisions for many years. Żmijewski himself emerged as an artist who took a discursive and clearly political position and began showing narratives about contemporary sociopolitical mechanisms, such as national chauvinism. He established a method of arranging a manipulated social situation, introducing a group of people into it, and testing how they behave and how they react when confronted. This practice was closely tied to a critical stance towards the actual sociopolitical impact of contemporary art world, its lack of consequences, empty theatrical gestures, and entanglement in accelerating neoliberalism. In 2007, Żmijewski published a proposal for applied social arts, which motivated his own artistic practice and artistic curatorial projects such as Selection.pl. Żmijewski's approach wanted to break with the discursive exhibition model, seen by him as hypocritic, relying on outdated grand concepts, involving too much open-ended rhetoric, and being too elitist. He claimed that this political usage of the institution would allow him to hijack the state itself as this is composed of institutions, including the cultural ones. The outcome of Selection.pl was an anti-exhibition, or rather exhibition without any form. There was no space for moderated expression, pushed away by aggression and destruction. The observers brought up the radicalism of the situation, dominated and manipulated by Althammer and Żmijewski, but also the hermetic quality of the project, which materialized in an empty space filled with shredded, overpainted paper. The involvement of alien stakeholders could be seen as the reason. Although inviting the intruders aimed to confront the participants with reality, the final outcome became a spectacle, or rather a sequence of soloists without any context, a stimulated social situation with all its unclarity, conflict, filth, and absurdity. In a moment pivotal to the project, one of the invited participants, Bartłomiej Kurzeja, exhibited a poster of Donald Tusk, then presidential election contestant, in a Wehrmacht uniform. This action caused a deep crisis among the group and elimination of Kurzeja from the project. This moment not only provoked questions about the sense of participation and the limits of free speech, but also manifested the way of how populism, often drawing on regressive fears, entered the public debate. On the other hand, it became a fulfillment of Żmijewski's goal, for the art scene to reflect the ideological landscape which could be found in politics. The totality of Selection.pl, with its blending of power hierarchies and the desire to reflect the wider sociopolitical paradigm, however, leads us towards considering it as trialing the medium of an exhibition as a site of radical democracy. This proposal drew from Żmijewski's understanding of the aims of art, clearly influenced by the work of Jacques Rancière, a philosopher interested in political potential of the people. Rancière understood democracy as a rule of the people who do not have stakes to execute it, and system ever including an element of anarchy. His proposal was close to Chantal Mouffe's antagonism, with its pluralistic nature of the social realm, for which the conflict is fundamental. Within those paradigms, the role of art is pivotal in the hegemonic struggle which characterizes the contemporary democratic order. As employed by Selection.pl, this model occurred as revealing several flaws, particularly when it comes to the chauvinistic political slander, which put the effectiveness of non-filtered participation to the test. At this crucial point, the fear of radical ideological difference and fear of destruction dominated the situation and led to withdrawals. Simultaneously, the legacy of this project may open the discussion about participatory models of exhibitions and their potential to impact and reflect the socio-political realm of all its aspects, including those which are refused by mainstream politics. The outcome suggests also the radical democracy participation within the art world as a process containing of social exchange and mutual commitment, rather than a set of independent performances. Its most problematic aspect, however, is located in non-linearity, randomness, and unpredictability. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mateusz. This was a very interesting presentation. I think we will have a lot of questions later.
Thank
now
you.
I would like to invite David Riep, Colorado State University, who dedicated most of his career to exploration of African art. He also is involved in an ongoing multidisciplinary project entitled Africa Meets Africa. And David Riep is also Associate Professor of Art History at Colorado State University and Associate Curator of African Art at the Gregory Alikar Museum of Art. We are looking forward to hear about women's work, inclusive innovations for a traveling exhibition, which also promises an interesting discussion about intercontinental cooperation. So David, if you're there.
Yes, I'm here.
You're welcome to present.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen. Okay. Well, hello, I'm David Riep, and I'm an art historian at Colorado State University. Today, I'll be presenting a case study on innovative museum practices as an example of democratizing international museum exchanges. Although my appointment at CSU is primarily academic, I also serve as Associate Curator of African Art at the Gregory Alikar Museum of Art. And in this role, I oversee the curation and programming for our nearly 1,300 objects that were created by artists across the African continent. While most of my curatorial activities are aimed at developing exhibitions for the university community and local stakeholders, we recently looked beyond our regional audiences through the development of an international traveling exhibition entitled Women's Work, Art and Sustainability in Contemporary Southeast Africa, which I will be discussing today. This exhibition explored the role of 21st century female artists in Southeast Africa as advocates of economic, social, and cultural sustainability. Against the backdrop of arts that have historically been considered women's work, such as pottery, beadwork, and mural painting, it highlighted the stories of 7 artists from Kenya and South Africa and explored the role of art production in both past and present through historical examples and contemporary expressions. Although the concept and content of this exhibition is by no means unique in comparison to other exhibitions across the globe, recent conversations regarding equity, diversity, and inclusiveness in the museum world challenged us to rethink previous approaches to traveling exhibitions. In our current socio-political climate, issues of diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion have garnered increased attention in the museum world. The past several years have seen conversations and critiques regarding issues of the repatriation of objects removed from the African continent during the colonial era, as well as recognizing and addressing institutional inequities and rethinking the curatorial process. These are important and challenging conversations that are not easily resolved, and I suspect that many communities across the globe will eagerly watch how these issues develop and move toward resolution. Such dialogues have motivated some of the major accrediting bodies to take action. For example, the American Alliance of Museums established a working group in 2018 aimed at diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion. The outcome of this group was the establishment of 5 key components of effective museum work, which you can see on the screen. Although the AAM is a US-focused association, this is not an insular discussion. Even the association's vision statement and core values suggest broader thinking and include phrasing such as a world informed and enriched by thriving museums, and we seek out to embrace a diversity of people and cultures to enhance our understanding of the world and to connect museums in a global context. This is but one example of the broader conversations moving across the museum world. However, much of the action taking place is aimed at internal institutional equity. But what about global institutional equity? Absent from this conversation is a critical look at the institutional practices and standards established by many accrediting bodies and their impact on museums across the globe. Many of the standards and practices aimed at object preservation unconsciously marginalize institutions that are unable to adhere to similar standards. For example, I've shared some excerpts from the Alikar Museum's standard loan policy. While many of our requirements are commonplace, such as requiring appropriate loan agreements, not physically jeopardizing or altering any objects, and obtaining permissions for photographs, there are others that are inherently limiting, such as those included here. So for example, requiring the borrowing institution to provide care and security for objects that are comparable to the Alikar Museum, requiring borrowing institutions to complete a AAM facilities report, putting the onus of packing and transportation costs on the borrowing institution, and in some cases, requiring a museum staff person to courier an object throughout its time at a visiting institution at the cost of the borrowing institution. So these practices are put in place with the goal of preserving objects and mitigating risk, and rightly so. Yet, this also begs the question, how can we develop truly inclusive global museum practices without sacrificing the things that make museums important? We attempted to engage this question through the development of the Women's Work exhibition. The idea for this exhibition stemmed from a summer study abroad trip where university students explored the visual arts of numerous communities across South Africa. One of these communities was located in Nkangala, Mpumalanga, where we met with Petrus Mahlangu, who is chief curator at the Khudwana Cultural Village and Museum. Through our time spent in Nkangala, the thought arose for creating a collaborative traveling exhibition between the university and the Khudwana Museum. Shortly thereafter, we began an extensive conversation on how we might take such an idea and bring it to fruition. However, it soon became evident that issues of funding, facilities, and logistics would present some steep challenges. It was at this point that we developed some inclusive practices that allowed for true collaboration without sacrificing voice and representation, costs, and preservation of the objects. These include equity and collaboration on content development, on-site curation, inclusivity of access, and negotiating best practices. When developing the exhibition theme and content, decisions were made to invite contributors from artists, museum professionals, community stakeholders, traditional leaders, and academics in the ideation, writing, and editing process. This involved months of email correspondence and relied on countless participants to collect and distill the input from everyone involved. In spite of the inherent challenges linked with language barriers, internet access, and availability, our efforts resulted in the development of a truly collaborative exhibition message. Another issue that needed to be addressed was object curation. The costs for packing, shipping, and insuring objects internationally was wildly prohibitive for both institutions. In addition, outgoing loans from the Alikar Museum require the approval of a stringent facility report, which is not easily met by institutions with limited support and funding. In response to these constraints, a decision was made for each host institution to select objects from their own permanent collections that visually demonstrated the exhibition content. This seemingly sidestepped the financial and structural constraints while adding a dynamic element to the exhibition display. Because this exhibition was aimed at multiple audiences, a key component centered on equity and accessibility. In order to engage with such issues, all text panels featured multiple voices, ranging from the artists themselves to cultural stakeholders, museum professionals, and scholars. Furthermore, the exhibition text panels were produced in both English and Izzi Ndebele, the two primary languages preferred among the local communities. In addition, an exhibition gallery guide was written in Spanish and was made available to US visitors throughout the show's duration. Similarly, all object labels were written in a way that acknowledged the agency of the artists and makers, whether they were individually known or not. In the case of historical objects, the agency of the individual was highlighted by referring to unknown artists rather than using broad cultural or geographical monikers. For example, with the label on the right, we use the phrase unknown Ndebele artist, whereas former approaches for displaying non-Western art might simply list the cultural moniker Ndebele. The historical approach of relying on culture rather than acknowledging the individual promotes the false notion that there is a singular representative style for each culture across the African continent and discounts the existence of fluid, variegated cross-cultural relationships, which have been the norm rather than the exception across the continent. In addition, the Alikar Museum has made it a practice to identify objects according to local vernaculars rather than prioritizing English and descriptive object labels. For example, one can see the primary nouns written in Izzi Ndebele with an English translation taking a secondary position. This practice is becoming more common in many US museums and represents another move toward equity in curatorial practice. Perhaps our most innovative approach centered on the exhibition materials themselves. As can be seen in the images, all text panels, photographs, and supporting materials were produced on vinyl, which is very cost-effective, lightweight, and durable. After the exhibition closed at the Alikar Museum, all materials were rolled up, placed in a cardboard shipping tube, and couriered to the Hodwana Museum for their installation and opening. This allowed for a consistent narrative across venues and directly assisted with production costs. The result was a dynamic, cost-effective, collaborative exhibition that maintained a clear theme, concept, and goals, while drawing upon the intellectual strengths and spectacular object collections of both partner institutions. The traveling components of the exhibition totaled less than $1,000 US, which was covered by an internal grant at Colorado State University, and included both production costs as well as artist honoraria. Women's work opened in fall 2018 in Fort Collins, Colorado, and traveled to Nkangala, Mpumalanga in summer 2019. And here you can see some of our contributors, my co-curator, Petrus Matlangu, and artists Sophie Matlangu and Esther Munguni. So in conclusion, this is one small example of how larger issues of diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion across museums can be addressed, even at a local level. As these important discussions continue to take place across the museum world, I hope that we'll continue to see other interesting and innovative collaborative approaches that will impact museum practice on a global scale. Thank you for your time.
Thank you on your presentation. And I hope that there will be more questions to discuss. Now I would like to invite Nina Mihalinets. Nina, are you there?
I think Nina is not there. She had some problems, so we can move to another participant.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we have as a panelist John Blakinger, Endowed Associate Professor of Contemporary Art at the University of Arkansas. He studies history, theory, and criticism of late modern and contemporary art, with a special interest in the relationships between aesthetics and politics. His book, Georgi Kapesh, Undreaming the Bauhaus, was selected by the New York Times as one of the best books of 2019. Blakinger is now at work on a contest of images, art, politics, and controversy, a book-length study that engages issues around race, identity, money, power, and politics at the museum. In this presentation, we will hear something more about one really unique case. So, John, if you're there.
Hi, yes. Let
You're
me
welcome to
share
do
my
this.
screen.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, hopefully that is working. And okay, so I decided to keep this very sort of informal, and hopefully I won't run over my 10 minutes. And I want to start by just thanking the organizers for the invitation to participate. It's really exciting for me to be able to do that, even from so far away here in the United States. So thank you. So I'd like to start actually by looking at an image. And it's an image that might be familiar to some of you. It circulated widely a few years ago. And it's an image that shows a migrant from Honduras named Maria Leila Meza Castro. And she's pictured in this image with her two young children. And she's fleeing a tear gas canister that was fired by US Customs and Border Protection officers at the US-Mexico border near Tijuana. We can see in this image that her face is contorted in confusion and fear. Her children are in diapers. One of them is in bare feet. They're scrambling over the ground. There's a fence behind them that is laced with barbed wire. And of course, in the distance, you can see an American flag. So this photograph is compelling for a number of reasons. I think one of them is that there's a visual contrast at the center. Meza Castro's t-shirt, it's in this sort of candy-colored pastels, and it shows Princess Elsa and Princess Anna from the Disney animated film Frozen. So one of the key things is that there's a contrast between this Disney imagery and then the sort of terror that we see registered on Meza Castro's face and in the actions and the movements of her two children. So this image was taken by a photojournalist, Kim Kyung-hoon, works for the company Reuters, and it went viral. It became an icon of the clashes over immigration that have convulsed US society over the past 5 years, really because of President Trump and following his call for a border wall 5 years ago. But it also incited outrage at a more unlikely target, the Whitney Museum of American Art in New York City. And so you can see here the image. I mean, it spread everywhere in the news media, circulated widely online, but it also started protests against the Whitney. And the reason was really this tear gas canister. So the tear gas canister was documented by journalists with the New York Times. There were some 24 such canisters fired at Leila Meza Castro. And journalists posted photographs of these canisters online. And this actually shows Meza Castro holding one of these tear gas canisters. And all of them are branded with the logo of Defense Technology, a manufacturer of crowd control weapons for military and police use, or what the company, Defense Technology, calls less lethal solutions. So a warning on the website where this tear gas canister can be purchased from Defense Technology explains the effects of the gas: irritation, burning sensation, coughing, the sensation of shortness of breath, tightness in chest, often accompanied by a feeling of panic, which I think we see in that image by Kim Kyung-hoon that went viral. So the parent company of Defense Technology happens to be a group called the Safariland Group, a global defense manufacturer that spans 19 different brands worldwide. The CEO and majority stakeholder of Safariland, Warren B. Kanders, was also, until recently, vice chairman on the board of trustees at the Whitney Museum in New York. So this association triggered a really dramatic series of events and protests at the Whitney. And it started in part after the website Hyperallergic posted a series of blog entries that documented these events, these protests, these connections. And that triggered 100 museum staffers to sign an open letter to Adam Weinberg, pictured here, the director of the Whitney Museum. A group called Decolonize This Place began a series of protests. This image shows the two main figures associated with this group, the artist, activist, Natasha Dillon, Amin Hussein, and they actually started a group called MTL, a sort of parent umbrella group, and one of the subgroups that they have also organized through MTL is called Decolonize This Place. And it has a sort of open structure. So they don't consider themselves organizers of this group. They help facilitate it, but many different people might participate in it at different times. So Decolonize This Place began protesting at the Whitney Museum, and they staged different interventions. You can see they gathered in the lobby, they had signs, they staged a series of protests, which then also went viral. They were promoted on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, online, and that was one key strategy for the group, using the internet to organize their protest, in addition to staging on-site protests at the Whitney Museum itself. So this is one of the case studies that I'm interested in and that I'm looking at in my current book project. And the key premise of my project is that these debates that became known as the culture wars from the 1980s, 1990s persist and perhaps have resurfaced in recent years in new and different ways. In the United States, I think it's definitely associated with the rise of the Trump era. And I'm interested in how the Trump era is transforming the visual arts, turning some of these spaces, the pristine space of the White Cube, for example, into a site for new forms of aesthetic activism and symbolic struggle. And I'm interested in some of the moral, ethical, and political questions that these struggles raise. So the idea of the culture wars, in an earlier generation, it's associated with imagery, works of art. I'm showing here an example from Robert Mapplethorpe, the photographer Andre Serrano, that were provocative and promoted outrage from a religious, conservative right wing. And what we're seeing in these more recent culture wars is actually progressive left wing staging an intervention at a museum site. So there's a shift, I think, in the politics and the site of these tensions. And some of the key hypotheses that I'm thinking about in looking at these case studies is that these controversies, like this example, Decolonize's place, they're both political and aesthetic. So they involve questions around politics, the influence of money in the museum, but they also incorporate, the activists use unique aesthetic visual strategies in their activism. My second hypothesis is that these controversies are both analog and digital. I've mentioned this. They take place on the ground. They involve responding to museum spaces, to works of art on view at the museum. But they also result in images that spread on social media and online. So the digital network is a key platform for some of this activism. And then third, my other hypothesis is that these controversies are about the present, but also the past. So they respond to very contemporary concerns and issues. But I think if we look more deeply, we'll see how these artists and activists are actually responding to the history of art and to earlier works of art in their own interventions. So to go in a little bit more deeply, I have some examples from how Decolonize's place responded to the presence of candors on the board of the Whitney. And so one thing that they did was use the Whitney Museum's own visual culture against the museum itself. So the museum was hosting at the time an exhibition on the artist Andy Warhol, and this was a show that was in part financed by Warren Candors. And they used the imagery, the promotional material related to that exhibition against the museum through various graphic interventions. So, I mean, here you can see some of these are very old school, I would say. I mean, they wrote on the subway billboards that advertised the Warhol exhibition, and they wrote "Warren Candors must go." So, I mean, simple vandalism and graffiti was certainly part of it. Here you can see they placed a sticker, Decolonize has placed a sticker on the billboard itself, but other interventions were more, I think, creative, and they actually reimagined some of the imagery associated with this exhibition. So here on the right is Warhol's painting green Coca-Cola bottles from 1962, which the activists reimagined as a series of tear gas canisters with, you can see branded that way, the same tear gas canister that was launched at Leyva Meza Castro at the US border. They also repurposed a series of Warhol's paintings in this manner. So this shows on the right, Jackie Kennedy before and after the assassination of JFK. And you can see again on the left, it's reimagined as a grid of tear gas canisters. We also have things like this painting, very famous Warhol painting, Ethel's Skull 36 times, one of Warhol's early portrait images intended to sell the sizzle of this ARTWORLD socialite. And here the group reimagines it not only as a grid of tear gas canisters, but also that image of Warren Candors and his wife with the director of the Whitney at a Whitney opening. So they have these, I would say, and here's the original photo, these interventions that play off of the imagery taking place at the museum itself, on view at the museum. On the right, another painting by Warhol of Superman from a cartoon strip, a comic strip. And then on the left, they've replaced the thought bubble quotation from the original painting with a comment that was actually taken from Twitter. It had been posted in response to the death of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, in 2014. And Brown was an 18-year-old Black man who was shot by white police officers, and that triggered violent demonstrations similar to the recent demonstrations, Black Lives Matter demonstrations in response to George Floyd. And they take a quotation that spread at the time on Twitter about how to respond to tear gas if you're attacked by tear gas. Always make sure to run against the wind when tear gassed. Keep calm, the pain will pass. Don't touch your face or put water on it. Instead use milk or Coke to wash away the tear gas. So some of these strategies, there we go, are, I think, familiar. They use ideas like culture jamming, brand hacking. Activists have done this before, of course. You could even trace it back to the 1950s, 1960s. The situation is international. Ideas like détourner, turning or rerouting imagery. But one thing that's substantially different is that the group often uses online formats in some of these interventions. So one example, of course, is the Whitney website here that advertised the Warhol show, also the billboard imagery, and they use this and feed off of it and create their own sort of interventions in response. And you can see they've even created fake billboards with the Safariland brand replacing the Warhol name, which these are actually not actual subway billboards. They're sort of photoshopped images that then the group posted online as if they were actual interventions into the physical space in New York City. And here's another one referencing, again, Ferguson. I've already mentioned that reference. And another thing they've done, which I think gets to the point of how their strategies depart from earlier interventions, reflects how they've manipulated the Whitney logo, this sort of flexible W logo for the Whitney Museum. And so they created a range of social media posts that manipulated into things like the spray from a tear gas canister, and then this phrase, "You uphold white supremacy," or here the Whitney W again, and then the brand Safariland. But one thing that's interesting is through their use of hashtags. I mean, you can see here they've used the Safariland hashtag, the Whitney Museum hashtag. The imagery appears in unusual feeds online as people, interact with Instagram. So if you go to the Safariland hashtag, you'll see Safariland's own imagery, weapons, people holding weapons, white people holding weapons, and then this phrase, "You uphold white supremacy," which has the effect of responding to Safariland's own imagery. There's a close-up of what this feed looks like. And then also Whitney Museum, it has the same effect. I mean, you see selfies of visitors to the Whitney standing in front of paintings, and then you have this really confrontational, aggressive, unsettling intervention that really targets all of these museum visitors. Here's, for example, someone standing in front of Warhol's paintings at the Whitney retrospective with this reminder, "You uphold white supremacy." So the strategies, I think, are familiar to many of us as earlier strategies, but they also involve using the digital platform in unusual ways. So I'm aware that I'm running over time, so I'm going to end here, and I'm happy to, when we get to Q&A, answer some questions, and I have more images as well that document some of their interventions. But maybe just to sort of sum up two, I think, key points about this example. So this example, I mean, it's about money and tainted money and funding. And so, two of the causes that I see, one of them is economic. It's the result, in part, of an earlier set of culture wars, which resulted in reduced government funding for the arts in the United States. And if there isn't government funding, there has to be private funding. And if there's private funding, it gets entangled in some of these complexities of extreme wealth accumulation that connect very directly to neoliberalism. And I think it's hard to avoid tainted money if you're accepting private money, which is now necessary for institutions. So the second And final point I'll make, the second cause that I see is really the digital network. So the internet, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, social media. I mean, I think we've seen this around the world everywhere, that social media has fueled intense polarization, political polarization, both for the left and the right. And I would say that Decolonize's place is aware of some of those strategies, ideas like fake news, manipulating imagery, using hashtags in activism, things that both the right and the left use. They also use themselves for better or worse to further their own ends. So I would say the digital network is another cause of some of these culture war clashes. So I'll end there. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your presentation. I think it was very interesting. And I suppose that our participants would have some questions for each other. In other case, we can start another circle of dialogues with Mateusz Sapija. I would like to ask you how Artur Żmijewski aesthetically approached this exhibition. I noticed that this was not the point at all in concept, or you think it was, and to which extent? We know that he did also Berlin Biennale a little bit later with a similar concept. And also another question is how much this concept was confusing for the participants?
Yes, thank you for that. And thank you also to other participants. Those were very, very interesting presentations. When it comes to the aesthetic aspect, this question somehow links to the second question you had. So the accessibility for the public. Żmijewski edited a video, and 1 hour video out of the whole process, which was perhaps the most accessible element of the exhibition. It was somehow the public of what has been somehow historicized. What are the records of the audience feedback is that they did feel confused, because when you were entering the exhibition, the room was either empty or it was a part of the situation that was not necessarily explained to you, in which people who already have been interacted with each other for a very long time have been doing actions, mostly without saying any words, basically. And Żmijewski, as his long-standing practice has been, he somehow initiated, accelerated, and manipulated the situation, and then edited a video out of it with barely any commentary, in which one of the most discussed scene is a scene when Paweł Althammer, another artist / curator, enters the gallery with his little daughter, which he pushes in a shopping trolley, and he encourages her to touch the objects and play with the exhibition installation. And she's being somehow shouted at by one of the security guards. So we again have this clash between somehow innocence of encountering art and museum oppression or a gallery oppression. So I guess there is some, maybe not necessarily aesthetic aspect into it, but a critical aspect towards which he develops out of it. Yeah.
Thank you. I think we have a question from Goran Tomka and Višnja Kisic. So I would like the organizers to include now Višnja.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for all the presentations. I have actually a question for David and then one for John as well. For David, and it concerns this idea of decolonizing the museum. But basically, what was interesting for me, David, in the case that you presented, was actually how going to Africa and working with the museum institution there has produced actually yet another exhibition that kind of tries to put creators from there in the context of artists and kind of tries to put them in the framework of the kind of European idea of the museum. And I wonder what emerged from your field work, kind of what were the your insights into the ways of kind of practicing the arts. Is it really seen as the practicing of arts? Is it another way of community creativity and ways of relating to each other and the creative process and tradition? So what would it be if we would kind of take the local kind of ontologies and epistemologies on these practices and then display them, really make them known to the museum audiences elsewhere? That's the question for David. The question for John is, well, the comment, it was really striking to see that this discussion kind of caused by an image and an event that occurred in the border really triggered a set of artworks that was limited to the kind of Whitney's museum complacency and one single kind of donor or board member. I'm wondering, did this event kind of produce larger discussions and revisions of who is sitting in the boards of American museums? In which kinds of things are they complacent around the world and in the US? And kind of, are there those kinds of actions and discussions that are being triggered? Thank you.
Thank you, Vishnya. I think we will first hear John or David.
Sure. Sure. Sorry, I was just muted. That's a great question. So, I mean, first of all, the simple answer is yes, there have been many other protests as well. So Decolonize's place aimed their own activism against Candor specifically, and he did ultimately resign from the board, so they were successful. And I think the way to understand it is they've selected one effective, compelling case study, one example of an extremely wealthy individual whose money is from potentially problematic, ethically problematic sources, who's on a museum board, and they've aimed that target directly to someone who is in the news, given the sort of situation, current events allowed it, made it, I think, made Candor's a good target. It's worth noting there are many other people on museum boards, obviously, and on the Whitney's own board, there are many. I mean, you know, a really sort of surprising number of problematic individuals who have links to the defense industry, to weapons manufacturer, to military in some way, military contracting, who provide arms for police agencies. I mean, whatever it is, I'm forgetting off the top of my head the names of individuals, but you know, connected, their wealth might be connected to a company that also, I know this is the case at the Whitney, wealth connected to a company that was providing some of the border control at the US border. It wasn't tear gas, but it was managing the cages. If you remember, the child separation policy, the cages that migrant children were put into. I mean, that company was also connected via a board member to the Whitney. So I think they've aimed it to be successful. Obviously, the issue is so much larger. And so, I mean, one thing to think about is like other groups have also done this. Nan Golden, the photographer, has a group called PAIN, which targets the presence of Sackler family funding in the arts and money linked to Purdue Pharma and the manufacturer of OxyContin and addictive opioid drugs, and the opioid crisis, I mean, especially in the US, but globally, So, I mean, that's another instance that has been very successful. Many museums around the world, I mean, Sackler money is really pernicious and everywhere. I mean, it's really shocking how entangled it is. Every institution, it seems, has some sort of Sackler wing or staircase or education center. And I mean, that's changing. Museums are refusing to accept the money. They're taking the name off the wall, off the staircase. So I think that these actions have been successful, but obviously, I mean, part of the problem is about capitalism, neoliberalism, accumulation of wealth to such an extreme amount, the lack of public funding. I mean, these problems are maybe larger than individuals, but I think it has triggered a reckoning with some of these other, some of, this much broader phenomena.
I think your answer answers also one more question that we had for you from Liang Kai-yu, who greeted us, and he also commented, are there any critical responses from the museum to the activism of Decolonize this place? So if you could only briefly add,
yes,
in this moment, was there any critical responses, any repercussions, any kind of public statements from the museum?
So initially the museum tried to downplay it. Adam Weinberg, he was trying, I think, to balance the demand for having wealthy individuals on the board and protecting their privacy, but also responding to artists and museum staff. And I think that's a really challenging position to be in. So he attempted to, I think, placate both sides, to express solidarity with migrants and sympathy for individuals crossing the border, but also the need to respect individuals on the board and not make the type of connection that Decolonize this place made. So I mean, he tried to avoid it, but it was unavoidable in the sense that Decolonize this place was persistent, and they continued to protest for many months, and it became I think it really gained traction at the Whitney Biennial. Some of the artists who were included, a group called Forensic Architecture, had a piece that actually documented Safariland tear gas and its use in the Middle East. And that was their contribution to the Whitney Biennial. So they really called out the presence of Candor's right there. Other artists pulled out of the biennial because of Candor's continued presence on the board. The artist Hannah Black authored a piece in Art Forum about this episode. So it became, it sort of became larger than Decolonize this place because it was connected to the biennial. And so ultimately, Candor's resigned. It's unclear if he was forced to. I don't really think he was forced to. I think he felt like, the unrelenting protests sort of pushed him to do so. So he is no longer on the board. It's not really the solution that the museum originally wanted. I think now they're probably glad that he is no longer there because he was attracting so much of this, negative press attention.
Thank you, John. Now we can hear from David. The question that Vishna proposed. And perhaps there is also a question, how does the community in America perceives African art, in fact, because it is taken out of the context.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'll start with the initial question, and this is, you raise a good point, and something that is widely discussed when it comes to working with objects from the African continent, and the idea of art, craft, artifact, and kind of decontextualizing. In this case, it was interesting because the artists that we were highlighting, the exhibition was focused on 7 specific artists, and all of them considered themselves practicing artists. One of them that was featured was Esther Mthlangu, who's has an international reputation, as commissions from BMW and Belvedere Vodka, and collaborates with John Legend, and has really kind of established herself as a international artist. And the others in the local community in South Africa are also practicing artists who really sustain their families by creating works of art from how they define it and selling it to local economies and visitors. We also featured individuals from Kenya, and these were women who were part of a really, really interesting community. It's linked with an NGO also at Colorado State University, where women in Samburu communities in Kenya were taking it upon themselves to leave oppressive situations that have to do with kind of traditional gender roles, and had created what they call the women's community, where they kicked out all of the men and brought their children in, and were creating beadwork that they were marketing as art to Western tourists in order to sustain their way of life. And so it was, in a sense, almost a relief that we were working with individuals who themselves asserted themselves as artists in the sense that we might view them from a Western sense, and having someone as high profile as Esther Matlangu certainly helped make that case. We were also able to kind of bridge that space between historical objects, functional objects that were coming from individuals on the African continent, because in the exhibition we had contemporary works from these individuals kind of alongside historical objects from the collections. And so it was through the text panels and doing interviews with the artists themselves, being able to kind of hear from their own voices how they're drawing connections between older objects, material culture, however we might want to define it in kind of the Western spaces, and how they were drawing from kind of the formal elements and incorporating that into what they were defining as art. So it was, in a sense, I was relieved in some ways, but I found it very interesting how the makers themselves were able to kind of tread what can be very tenuous ground. And I thought that was also important for, especially when we had the exhibitions in the two different locations, you know, the local audiences think about these objects in very, very different ways. I mean, individuals who are coming into the Alikar Museum have a mindset that when you step into this space that you are having an engagement with what is being considered a work of art, because it's been removed from its context, it's on a wall, there's a case, there's a light shining on it, you can't touch it. It elevates it into art with a capital A. And in Kangala at the Hodwana Museum, you know, these are objects that are still very much in use today. The museum there had phenomenal historical collections of, you know, objects that, you know, in Western museums would be these sort of highly guarded, elevated works of art, but locally were recognized as functional parts of, you know, the thread that holds society together. So it was interesting to see, especially older visitors from the community in Hodwana going into the space and, you know, seeing these very familiar objects, but in a, you know, in a context that was unfamiliar to them, even within their own space. So going in and seeing aprons that are being worn by mothers when their sons are coming back from initiation, you know, today, and seeing it kind of put inside a case at the Hodwana Museum, and, you know, listening to how the artists were kind of talking about this great active visual material and how it's inspiring them to kind of reinterpret or draw inspiration and kind of folding it into their contemporary art practice. So it was very different dialogues, and I wish that I would have had a chance to kind of document a lot of what the visitors were saying, because I think that was even more dynamic than anything else that was going on with the exhibitions. Just the reception of it in these two very different spaces was for me really interesting.
Thank you, David. Now I would like to perhaps end this panel, but only one more remark for Mateusz Sapija. We have noticed that most of the participants in this concept of art Żmijewski were wearing masks and protective clothes, at least on the photographs that you have shown us. This was held some years ago. How would you comment that?
I think that there was a lot of use of somehow controlled paint, spray, fire. So it's simply I don't know, health and safety situation. I know that in current times it brings a very different connotation.
So we could say maybe that sometimes breakthrough in museum practices can predict also some things in the future whatsoever.
Exactly.
I would like to express my regret and apologize from Nina Mihalinec, who is one of the chief organizers of this conference and who was unfortunately due to leave and is unable to present us at this panel her paper, but I hope that we will have a chance to hear it during the conference that is lasting today and tomorrow. Thank you on your participation. It was very nice to hear all these presentations, and I hope our audience got some interesting perspectives.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.